Hello again everybody, and today I have a subject for you which is entirely suitable for April the 28th, given that this is International Workers' Memorial Day, a day recognised around the world, including by the British government, as a day of commemorating those who have died during the course of their employment. And if ever there was anybody who was going to qualify for this, it would be a Roman gladiator, because every day that they went to work, every day that they were there for entertainment, there was the possibility of death. That was the whole point. So today I'm going to talk about Spartacus. A little bit of background. Since about 100 BC, the Romans had really got the taste for gladiators as entertainment. They were slaves, but they were running out of people trained as gladiators, so they'd become a very valuable commodity. Quite a lot of money and time was spent on training these people, and they wanted them to be bigger and tougher and more skillful than ever before. So there was a lot of money in this business. Now Spartacus, according to Plutarch and Florus, historians and biographers, was born in Thrace, in roughly what is now Bulgaria, I guess. There are various mysteries about his early life. He may have been sold into slavery as a sort of young man, but it seems that he spent some time as a Roman soldier before he deserted and was then sold into slavery. He'd be an auxiliary soldier rather than a legionary. He was sold as a gladiator because of his size and his strength and his skill with the sword. And it seems that he was sent to the training school of Lentulus Batiatus at Capua near Naples. Now Capua was regarded at the time as being absolutely the best place to go for gladiators to train, and there were a number of gladiator schools there. So it was a real sort of hotbed of gladiating. The training for a gladiator was brutal. Not everybody survived the training. It was immensely physically stressful, and of course these men being slaves, there's also the stress of the lack of your freedom in this. Some of this you can see quite graphically represented in Stanley Kubrick's film with Kirk Douglas training as a gladiator. There's a number of other kind of sword and sandal epics from Hollywood where you get some sense of the brutality. Nowhere near as much as the brutality you get in the somewhat gratuitous violence of the Spartacus Blood and Sand TV series. Anyway, the rebellion against the harsh treatment in this gladiator school started in 73 BC. We're told that it started initially with kitchen utensils, which seems comically trivial, but some gladiators fought their way out of the training school and then rapidly armed themselves with swords and spears and armour, which were taken from a few Roman soldiers who had been sent out to recapture them. Perhaps taking for granted that these were slaves and so there'd be easy pickings, they neglected that these were the toughest men of all. In fact, these were gladiators. So there was a lot of support for the gladiator revolt, the slave revolt, particularly from the countryside, not so much from the towns. There was a little bit of tension, we think, between city slaves, who were regarded as a bit softer, and rural slaves working on farms, often in more or less chain gang sort of conditions, being worked to death. And so there was particular support from rural slaves who fled, risked being branded, risked being crucified, but so desperate were their conditions that's what they did. Soon, the slaves who'd revolted took refuge on Mount Vesuvius, and people flocked to them from all over. Maybe there were some displaced veteran soldiers who also flocked to their cause too. In not very long, there were 70,000 people under the command of, we hear, Spartacus and Crixus and Oenomaus. You don't hear quite so much about Crixus and Oenomaus, but they were initially two of the three leaders of this slave revolt. It seems that Spartacus was pretty good as a military tactician, perhaps confirming some of his early training as a Roman soldier. There was a lot of marching up and down Italy. There was a question that they might escape by crossing the Alps, and a lot of the German and Gaulish slaves might have done that, but they decided they were going to trek south again. There was, at one point, it seemed as if they might attack the city of Rome itself, but they ended up more or less in the heel of Italy, and they faced the combined legions of Crassus and Pompey. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, one of the most brutal, and Pompey, who was very much a rising star of the army and also very much a political player at this point. And each of these men commanded a large number of soldiers, more or less as their personal, private, political army, and that came to be a theme of the 1st century BC. At the end of all this, Spartacus and his rebels were betrayed, and they suffered the terrible punishment of crucifixion, and there was a mass crucifixion along the Appian Way south of Rome. This was presumably to terrify everybody else, so that it would make sure that nobody else was going to revolt in the way that Spartacus had done. It shows Rome's fear of a slave uprising and the possibility of violent oppression of that by the ruling class. Now, the afterlife of Spartacus is quite interesting. In terms of its immediate historical importance, Spartacus allowed Pompey and Crassus to raise their more or less private armies, and that led to it fueled the fires of the civil war. But in modern times, Spartacus has been idolised, particularly by those on the left. In the early part of the 20th century, there was the Spartacist movement in Germany, a revolutionary group in the 1910s, 1920s. In Eastern Europe, in the days of the Soviet Union, there were a large number of sports clubs whose name Spartak still exists now. So football clubs like Spartak Moscow, for instance, a number of clubs also in the Ukraine. But Spartacus has always been a very popular subject for TV and film. And the most famous of these is probably the 1960 film, eventually directed after some dispute by Stanley Kubrick, starring Kirk Douglas. And it's this that I want to leave you with, because there's a very famous prologue. Politically, it was a controversial film because it was opposed by the McCarthyite right, who'd been dominating Hollywood in the 1950s. So this prologue was regarded as really quite left-wing for its time. So this is what the voiceover says at the very beginning of the film. In the last century, before the birth of the new faith called Christianity, which was destined to overthrow the pagan tyranny of Rome and bring about a new society, the Roman Republic stood at the very centre of the civilized world. Of all things fairest, sang the poets, first among cities and home of the gods is golden Rome. Yet even at the zenith of her pride and power, the Republic lay fatally stricken with a disease called human slavery. The age of the dictator was at hand, waiting in shadows for the event to bring it forth. In that same century, in the conquered Greek province of Thrace, an illiterate slave woman added to her master's wealth by giving birth to a son whom she named Spartacus. There, under whip and chain and sun, he lived out his youth and his young manhood, dreaming the death of slavery 2,000 years before it would finally die. So that's the message or the theme that I'd really want to leave you with today, that Spartacus is an example to us all of the fight against slavery.